There is a point past which nothing created has ever gone, and the Quran gives it a name, not a metaphor for a limit. A named location, mentioned in a specific chapter, in a passage describing something the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, actually witnessed. The tradition treats it as a real boundary at the outer edge of everything that was made. And here is what makes this subject different from almost anything else in Islamic teaching. We have the name, we have the location. We have several Sahih narrations describing what was around it and what happened there. And on the single most important question, what it actually is, the Quran deliberately does not tell us. That refusal is not a gap in the record, it is the record. And by the end of this, you are going to understand why the most careful scholars in the history of this tradition looked at this one subject and chose to stop talking. The passage is in chapter 53, called An-Najm, the Star. It is one of the earliest Meccan chapters, and it contains the Quran's most direct description of what the Prophet, peace be upon him, saw at the top of the ascent. He saw him in another descent, at the Lot tree of the utmost boundary. Near it is the garden of refuge. When there covered the Lot tree that which covered it, the sight did not swerve, nor did it transgress. He certainly saw of the greatest signs of his Lord. Read that again slowly, because 5 things happen in those lines, and most people only catch 2 of them. A location is named, a second location is placed beside it. Something covers the tree, and the covering is left undescribed. His vision is described as neither wandering nor overreaching. And then a summary statement, that what he saw was among the greatest signs of his Lord. That 4th line is the one nobody talks about, and it is the key to this entire video. Hold on to it. Now, let us take the name apart, because the name is doing more work than any translation carries. Sidrat al-Muntaha. 2 words. The first, Sidra, is not exotic. It is the ordinary Arabic word for a specific tree, the lote, known to botanists as ziziphus, and known across the Arabian Peninsula as the nabk or sidra. It is a real plant. It grows in dry ground, it is thorny, it produces a small fruit, and it survives conditions that kill almost everything else. Bedouin travelers rested under them. They are unremarkable in the way that a thing you see every day is unremarkable. That is the word the Quran uses for the boundary marker of creation. The second word is where the meaning concentrates. Al-Muntaha comes from the Arabic root nun haya, which carries the sense of finishing, ending, reaching a limit. The same root gives you the word for prohibition, for the point where something is forbidden to continue. Al-Muntaha is the terminal point, the place where a thing arrives and does not go further. So, the name is not the tree of heaven, and it is not the tree of knowledge, and it is not the tree of life. Every one of those would be a description of what the tree contains. The name describes where it stands. That is a boundary marker, and the tradition understood it exactly that way. There is a report from Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, may Allah be pleased with him, explaining the name directly, that everything ascending from the earth terminates there, and everything descending from above terminates there. Traffic in both directions stops at the same place. 6 doors were opened for him on the way up, and behind each one a prophet was waiting. Then the doors ran out, and this is what was standing at the end of them. Here is where we are, and here is what this video is not. This is not a video about what the tree looks like. There is a whole genre of content that treats Sidrat al-Muntaha as a puzzle to be solved with imagery, stacking descriptions until the audience feels they have seen something. We are not doing that. And the reason is that the primary source refuses to do it, and the primary source refuses on purpose. The question worth asking is not what the boundary looks like. It is what it means that there is one. Because think about what a boundary at the edge of creation actually implies. It implies that creation has an edge, that the made world is finite, that it terminates somewhere, and that the terminating happens at a defined place rather than trailing off into nothing. It implies a difference in kind between what is inside the boundary and what is beyond it, because a limit only exists where 2 unlike things meet. And it implies something uncomfortable about knowledge. If everything that ascends stops there, then that includes understanding. Every question that travels upward reaches the same tree and goes no further. That is a genuinely strange claim to find in a scripture, because it is a claim about the ceiling of religion itself. Plenty of traditions promise that sufficient devotion eventually delivers full comprehension, that the veil comes off for whoever earns it. This passage says something else. It says there is a fixed limit, that it is built into the structure of what was made, and that even the furthest traveler arrived at it rather than through it. The limit is not a punishment, and it is not a test you can pass. It is simply where creation ends. That is the actual subject of this video. We are going to walk through 4 things. What the narrations say was covering it, what was reported at its base, what was given at that station, and then the 4th, which is the honest, scholarly position on its nature, and which is the reason this topic has a reputation for being handled carefully by people who handled nothing else carefully. The restraint is not an absence of content. The restraint is the content. We start with the covering, because that is where the Quran does its most deliberate work. When there covered the lote tree that which covered it. That is the entire verse, chapter 53, verse 16. In Arabic, it is even tighter than the English. Id yakhsha as sidrata ma yakhsha. The verb appears twice, and between the 2 appearances sits the word ma, which here functions as an indefinite, meaning that which, or the thing that, or simply whatever it was. So what you have is a verb, repeated, with a blank sitting where the subject should be. Now consider how easy it would have been to fill that blank. The Quran is not a text that struggles for vocabulary. It describes the fire, the garden, the scales, the bridge, the faces of people on the Day of Judgment, in language of enormous specificity. It tells you what the fruit of the tree of Zakum resembles. It is not a book that goes vague when it runs out of words. It goes vague here, once, at the highest point in the entire narrative. Yusuf Ali, translating this line, gave up on literal rendering and wrote that the tree was shrouded in mystery unspeakable, which is not a translation so much as an admission. And that admission is closer to the sense of the Arabic than a tidy paraphrase would be. Now watch what happens to the commentators. The narrations do offer a description, and it is a strange one. In Sahih Muslim, in the narration recorded as Hadith 173, transmitted from Abdullah, may Allah be pleased with him, the covering is described in 2 words, golden moths. Some translations render it as butterflies of gold. The sub-narrator Sufyan, when he transmitted it, is reported to have made a fluttering motion with his hand while he said it, because the word alone was not landing. Ibn Kathir, in his commentary, transmits an additional report describing it as a covering of gold. So we have moths of gold, butterflies of gold, and a mat or covering of gold. 3 renderings, all involving gold, all attempting the same impossible thing. And notice that not one of them is presented in the Quran itself. The Quran had the opportunity and passed on it. Everything specific we have about the covering comes from narrators reaching for an image afterward, and the images do not fully agree with one another. Think about what that means for how you should hold this. The most detailed picture available to us is a comparison to insects, made by men who had just been told something they could not describe, using the brightest material they knew. And look at what the comparison is reaching for. Not size, not shape, not structure, movement and light. Something in motion, catching brightness, in numbers too great to resolve into individual objects. That is why Sufyan moved his hand when he said it. The word was carrying a quality rather than a form, and a gesture communicated the quality better than the noun did. Anyone who has watched a swarm of anything catch sunlight knows exactly the visual effect being pointed at, and also knows that describing it accurately is impossible. You can say what it resembled. You cannot say what it was, which is precisely the position every witness to this event has been in, including the one who was there. A gold moth is not an explanation. It is a person pointing. And here is the detail that proves the silence was a choice rather than a shortage of language. The tree itself does get described, specifically and in concrete physical terms. In the same narration in Sahih al-Bukhari, he said its fruits were like the large clay storage jars of Hajar, a town near Medina whose pottery his listeners would have handled. He said its leaves were like the ears of elephants. Those are not vague images. Those are measurements, given by comparison to objects a 7th century Arab could picture immediately. One is a container from a place down the road. The other is an animal that had appeared outside Mecca within living memory of that generation. So the account is perfectly willing to give you dimensions. Fruit, this big, leaves, this wide. The description is direct, physical, and quantitative in the way that a person genuinely reporting an observation would be. And then the covering arrives, and the same voice that just measured the fruit against a jar says only that something covered it. That is the shape of honest testimony. A witness who describes what he can and marks the place where description fails is behaving completely differently from a witness who describes everything with equal confidence. The narration hands you exact comparisons right up to the boundary of the sayable, and then it stops, and it tells you that it is stopping. There is one more thing placed beside the tree in that passage, mentioned, and then left alone in exactly the same way. Near it, the verse says, is the Garden of Refuge, Jannat al-Mawa. It is named, it is located, and nothing further is said about it in that passage at all. Now the second movement, and this one has a specific trap in it that I want to walk you past carefully. At the base of the tree, the prophet, peace be upon him, described 4 rivers. The account is in Sahih al-Bukhari, in the long night journey narration transmitted from Malik ibn Sa'sa. He said there were 4 rivers, 2 of them hidden and 2 of them visible. He asked Gabriel what they were. The answer was that the 2 hidden ones are 2 rivers in paradise, and the 2 visible ones are the Nile and the Euphrates. The Nile and the Euphrates. 2 rivers you can go and stand beside. Here is the trap. It is extremely tempting to take that and run somewhere with it. To make it a claim about the physical sources of those 2 rivers, or a hidden geographical statement, or a scientific assertion smuggled into a 7th century text. The classical scholars did not read it that way, and it is worth being precise about why. Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, commenting on this passage in his commentary on al-Bukhari, discusses the different views and treats the connection as one of origin and blessing rather than physical plumbing. The dominant reading among the commentators is that the 2 named rivers are being connected to their source in the divine decree, not that the narration is disclosing a hydrological fact about where their water physically comes from. Some scholars held that the meaning concerns the blessing that flows through them, given what those 2 rivers made possible in the ancient world. Egypt and Mesopotamia, the 2 river civilizations, both of which were cradles of prophetic history. We are not going to convert that into a science claim, and the reason is not timidity. It is that the narration is not structured as one. It is a man describing what he saw and asking a question about it, and receiving an answer that connects a thing above to a thing below. Reading it as a hidden data point requires ignoring what the passage is actually doing. And notice the structure of those 4 rivers, because the structure is the message. 2 hidden and 2 visible, a pairing, with half of it accessible and half of it not. He is standing at the boundary of creation, and he is shown 4 things flowing, and he can identify exactly half of them. Gabriel names the other half as belonging to paradise, which is another way of saying they are not available for inspection. That ratio keeps appearing on this night. Something shown, something withheld, in the same frame, at the same time, the tree measured and the covering unnamed. 2 rivers you can visit, and 2 you cannot. A garden named and not described, which brings us to the third movement, and this is the one that reframes everything. He was at the boundary of creation, the furthest point any created being has reached. If you were going to receive something at that location, what would you expect it to be? Most people, if they are honest, would expect knowledge. The structure of the universe, the date of the hour, an answer to the questions nobody can answer. That is not what was given. The narration in Sahih Muslim states it plainly. 3 things were given at that station: the 5 daily prayers, the concluding verses of Surah al-Baqarah, the 2 verses at the end of the 2nd chapter, and forgiveness of the grave sins for those of his community who die without associating anything with God. Read that list again and notice what kind of things they are. A daily schedule, a short passage to recite, and a guarantee about the end. Not one of the 3 is information about the cosmos. At the outer limit of everything created, standing at the point past which no created thing has ever gone, what was handed over was a routine, a prayer, and a mercy. The 5 prayers you already know about. The verses at the end of al-Baqarah are the ones that end with a plea not to be burdened beyond capacity and a request for pardon. And the third gift is the broadest of the 3, a pardon for the gravest sins attached to a single condition, that a person die without ascribing partners to God. The word used in the narration for those sins refers to the ones of the worst magnitude, the ones that drag a person into the fire. Take those three together, and something becomes obvious about what this journey was for. Every one of them is portable. Every one of them works on the ground, in an ordinary life, without any of the circumstances of that night. A person who has never had a vision, never left their town, and never seen anything unusual in their life can do all three. The prayers are performed by a laborer between shifts. The verses are recited by someone lying awake. The condition of the third is the simplest statement in the religion. The furthest a created being has ever traveled, produced instructions that fit in a single sentence and require nothing but a person and their day. That is worth sitting with for a moment, because it inverts what you would expect from a story about reaching the edge of the universe. The reward for the ascent was not access. It was assignment. He was not shown the machinery and sent back as an expert. He was given a schedule and sent back as a servant. And the content of what he brought back is almost aggressively practical. Compare that against what the surrounding culture would have done with the same opportunity. Ascent literature was not unique to this tradition. Stories of holy men traveling upward through celestial levels circulated widely in the ancient Near East, and they share a common payoff. The traveler comes back holding secrets, usually names, hidden knowledge, the mechanics of the heavens, or the schedule of the end. Information that separates the one who ascended from everyone who did not. This account had every opportunity to do that and did the opposite. The man who went furthest came back with the most ordinary possible set of instructions, and those instructions were for everybody. Quick word before we continue. If this is landing for you, take a second to subscribe and hit that like button. It genuinely moves this channel forward more than you would think. And I want your answer in the comments on this one, because the question underneath this whole video is a real one. If creation has a boundary, and everything that goes up stops at it, what does that tell you about the limits of what a human being can ever know? Do you find that idea unsettling, or do you find it a relief? Tell me honestly. I read them all. Then stay with me, because the last movement is where the great commentators put their pens down, and understanding why they stopped is the entire point of this video. Back to the boundary. The fourth movement is the one this video exists for, and it starts with an admission. The narrations do not fully agree about where Sidrat al-Muntaha is. In the long night journey account, in Sahih al-Bukhari, the one that walks gate by gate through the heavens, the tree is reached after the seventh. That is the sequence most people know. But the narration in Sahih Muslim that we just quoted, the one listing the three gifts, places it at the sixth heaven. Both of those are in the most rigorously authenticated collections in Sunni Islam. Both are accepted, and they say different things. The scholars noticed this a very long time ago and offered reconciliations. The most commonly transmitted is that the tree is rooted at one level and extends upward past it, so that different narrators, describing the same object, correctly named different heavens, depending on which part they were describing. Others held that the two narrations preserve wording from separate occasions when the Prophet, peace be upon him, related the night. Notice what the commentators did not do. They did not suppress one narration to protect the other. They did not quietly harmonize the text and present a clean version. They wrote down both, flagged the difference, offered possibilities, and left the matter open. That is the standard this subject has been held to, and it is why it is worth trusting. Consider how unusual that is. A tradition inventing a story about its founder reaching the summit of creation has every incentive to present a single, seamless account. Discrepancies in a fabricated narrative are a liability, and the obvious move is to smooth them out before anyone notices. What actually happened is that the discrepancy was preserved in the two most important books in Sunni Islam, sitting a few hundred pages apart, waiting for somebody to spot it. They kept the seam because they were transmitting rather than composing. Here is a second example, and this one matters because it is probably the single most repeated claim about Sidrat al-Muntaha on the internet. You have almost certainly heard that Gabriel stopped at the tree and could go no further, and that he said something to the effect that if he advanced a finger breadth, he would be burned. That detail is not in Sahih al-Bukhari, and it is not in Sahih Muslim. It circulates widely, it appears in later material, and versions of it are transmitted in weaker chains and in commentary literature. What the two most rigorous collections actually establish is the boundary itself, the description of the tree, the covering left unnamed, the rivers, and the three gifts. The dramatic line about burning is not part of that core. I am not telling you that to embarrass anyone who has repeated it. It is a memorable line, and it points at something the sources do establish, which is that the boundary is genuinely a boundary. I am telling you because a video about the limits of knowledge that quietly ignored the limits of its own sourcing would be a bad video, and because the difference between what is rigorously established and what merely circulates is exactly the muscle this subject is training. And this is the pattern across the whole subject. The further you get from the two sahihs on Sidrat al-Muntaha, the more vivid the descriptions become. The volume of detail rises exactly as the reliability falls. That relationship is worth remembering well beyond this one topic, because it holds almost everywhere in religious literature. Now, why did the great commentators stop? Go and look at what Ibn Kathir does with verse 16. He transmits the reports, he names his sources, he gives the golden covering, and then he moves on. Al-Qurtubi surveys the opinions and declines to settle the nature of the thing. Al-Tabari collects the transmissions and does not synthesize them into a picture. These are men who wrote thousands of pages, who argued over grammar and legal detail at extraordinary length, and who had no reluctance whatsoever about long explanations. On this, they go short. That is not how commentary literature normally behaves. When a passage is difficult, the standard response in that genre is to expand, to survey every transmitted view, to weigh the grammar, to run through the possibilities at length. Difficulty usually produces volume. Here, the difficulty produces silence, and it produces it consistently across scholars, separated by centuries, and by schools who agreed on very little else. When commentators who disagree about almost everything all decline the same question, that convergence is telling you something. The reason is embedded in the passage itself. In the line I told you to hold on to at the beginning, the sight did not swerve, nor did it transgress. That verse is describing his vision at that moment, and it is describing it in the language of restraint. The word for swerve carries the sense of deviating, drifting off the mark, looking away towards something else. The word rendered as transgress carries the sense of exceeding, overstepping, going past a proper limit. His eye did not wander, and his eye did not overreach. The Quran, at the highest point in the entire account, pauses to praise the discipline of a gaze. That is a remarkable thing to single out. He is at the boundary of creation, in the presence of the greatest signs of his Lord, and the quality the text chooses to commend is that he did not look around, and he did not look past. Not his courage in getting there, not his worthiness, his restraint. And the next verse tells you the outcome. He certainly saw of the greatest signs of his Lord. Note the wording carefully, because it contains a limit of its own. He saw of the signs, some of them, a portion. Even at the furthest point any created being has reached, the account describes a partial view, and describes it without a trace of disappointment. That is the model, and the commentators understood it as one. If the man who was actually present kept his vision within its limit, then a scholar sitting in Baghdad or Damascus centuries later, working from a transmitted report, has no business constructing a panorama. The restraint in the tafsir literature is not a failure to produce content. It is obedience to the pattern of the passage. There is a word for the category this belongs to. The Quran itself, in chapter 3, divides its verses into the clear and the ambiguous, and says that those firmly grounded in knowledge respond to the ambiguous by saying that they believe in it, and that all of it is from their Lord, not by decoding it, by holding it. Sidrat al-Muntaha sits in that category, and the tradition has treated it accordingly for 1400 years. So, let us say clearly what can be said, and then stop where the sources stop. There is a boundary at the edge of creation. It is named in the Quran. It is described using an ordinary desert tree, with fruit compared to clay jars and leaves compared to the ears of elephants. Something covered it, and what covered it is not disclosed. Near it is a garden that is named and not described. At its base are 4 rivers, 2 of which can be visited, and 2 of which cannot. Everything that ascends from below terminates there, and everything that descends from above terminates there. And at that place, 3 things were given, all of them meant for ordinary life on the ground. Beyond that, the honest answer is that its nature is not something the sources define. and that anyone offering you a fuller picture is offering you something the tradition did not preserve. And that list is not thin. Read it back and notice how much is actually there. A name, a location, a physical description, a neighboring place, 4 rivers with 2 of them identified by name, a functional definition of what the boundary does in both directions, and 3 specific things granted at that spot. For a subject whose entire character is that it exceeds description, the sources are remarkably generous. They give you everything up to the edge. What they will not do is manufacture the part that was withheld, and that refusal is the most valuable thing in the file. And then he came down. That is the part of this story that gets almost no attention, and it is the part that matters most for anyone watching this. He did not stay. Whatever happened at that boundary, however far it exceeded description, the account does not end with him remaining there. He descended, passed back down through the levels, and returned to Mecca, to the same city where his own tribe had rejected him, where he had lost his uncle and his wife within a short span, and where the following morning he would have to describe this to people who were going to laugh at him. And they did. When he told them, some of them mocked it openly, and the narrations record that a number of people who had accepted his message walked away over this specific claim. He went to the edge of creation and came back to a town where he was not believed. There is something almost unbearable about the ordinariness of that morning. Whatever he had seen the night before, the sun came up over the same streets, the same people were in them, and the same objections were waiting. He had no evidence. He could not take anyone with him, and he could not bring anything back to show. The narrations record that he was questioned about Jerusalem specifically, since some of those present had traveled there and could check his description, and that he described the city to them. But nothing above the first heaven was open to verification by anyone. On the entire ascent, the tree, the covering, the rivers, the boundary, he had only his word, and he told them anyway. Think about what he brought with him. Not a description, not a proof he could hand to a skeptic. 3 things that only make sense if you already trust the source. A schedule of prayer, 2 verses, and a promise about how a person's account is settled at the end. The boundary did not come back with him. Nobody else has ever been shown it, and nobody else ever will be in this life. What came back was a set of instructions for people who will never see any of it. And that includes every person watching this. Nobody in this audience is going to stand at that boundary. Nobody in the 14 centuries between that night and this one has, apart from the man who was taken there. Whatever Sidrat al-Muntaha is, it is not on any itinerary available to us. But the 3 things that came down from it are available to every single person today, without qualification or preparation. That asymmetry is the entire design. The unreachable thing produced reachable instructions, and the instructions were distributed to people who would never have access to their source. That is the actual gift, and it is easy to miss because it looks so plain. Every one of the 5 prayers is a small daily rehearsal of the same thing this whole account teaches. You stand, you recite words that were given rather than composed, you bow, you place your forehead on the ground, and at no point in the process are you told the mechanism of what you are participating in. You are given a form and a promise, and the understanding is not part of the package. The Sidra is where that arrangement is stated at cosmic scale. There is a place where knowledge stops. It is real, it has a location, and the created world ends at it, which means the frustration a person feels at not being able to understand everything is not a flaw in them. It is the shape of the situation. Every question that travels upward arrives at the same tree, and the tree has been there the entire time. Nobody is failing a test by reaching it. The people in this account who behave best are the ones who stop cleanly. The vision that does not swerve. The commentators who write 2 lines and close the book. The scholars who record a discrepancy and decline to resolve it. In a subject about the outer limit of the created world, every single figure worth imitating is imitating the same behavior, which is knowing where to stop and stopping there without embarrassment. And there is a verse that follows from that, which is the last thing worth saying here. Chapter 39, verse 53. Say, O my servants who have transgressed against themselves, do not despair of the mercy of God. Indeed, God forgives all sins. Indeed, He is the forgiving, the merciful. Notice that this one is not ambiguous. There is no covering over it, Nothing left undescribed, no scholarly caution required. The boundary of creation is stated in language nobody can fully unpack, and the mercy is stated in language a child can understand. The things that were kept back were kept back. The thing you actually need was made as plain as it could possibly be made. There is a point past which nothing created has ever gone. You are not required to see it, and you were never going to be. You were only ever asked to believe that it is there, and to keep the appointment you were given on the way back down.